Nothing But the Truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly x-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. In this episode, we will look at why India's big free trade agreement with the European Union is being called the mother of all trade deals, and why it could change what Indians pay, what Indian factories sell, and where India's next wave of jobs could come from. Mind you, after 18 years of starts, stops, freezes, and restarts, India and the European Union are now ready to sign the free trade agreement. It is coinciding with senior EU or European Union leaders visiting New Delhi to be the chief guest for India's Republic Day and also for the 16th India-EU Summit. Let's be clear, this is not just another tariff-cutting exercise. It will be India's largest FTA in terms of economic size and regulatory scope. Also, because the EU is a customs union, and this agreement gives Indian businesses preferential access across all 27 European Union countries or EU countries. Now, the EU agreement would be India's 9th trade deal concluded by the Modi government in the last 4 years. If you recall, the other free trade agreements include agreements with Mauritius, the UAE, Australia, New Zealand, Oman, the EFTA bloc, the UK, and members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or IPEF. But the big bilateral trade deal between India and the US is still pending, with America imposing a high 50% tariff after President Donald Trump started his second term in January 2025. So the American deal is still pending, but the India-EU trade deal is seen as one of the ways India is offsetting the impact of the adverse US tariffs that we face, which I mentioned was 50% in many of these goods and services that we have with them. It is also a signal to America that India is not solely dependent on it to shore up its exports. Interestingly, for years, the EU trade agreement was called the trade agreement that India was negotiating with the EU was called the BTIA, or the Broad-Based Trade and Investment Agreement. That label is gone and replaced with the Free Trade Agreement, or FTA, and this was after talks resumed in 2022, and both sides decided to break the negotiations into modules. That's because, this time it covers the India-European Union Free Trade Agreement covers goods, services, trade rules, investment protection, of course, and geographical indications. Now, each of these are being negotiated separately and has been negotiated. It's a very deliberate redesign because the earlier everything in one model was too ambitious and repeatedly got struck on red lines. So why should you and me care about the FTA with Europe, the European Union, and why is it being called the mother of all the trade deals? Let me just give you a bit of explanation. Largely because Europe is a rich, stable market. It has roughly 450 million high-income consumers, and Indian exports already have a strong base there. For instance, in financial year 2025, India exported $75.9 billion worth of goods to the EU and imported around $60.7 billion, which means that India ran a trade surplus in goods with the EU. Now, if you add services, then the bilateral trade in goods and services with the EU is currently over $190 billion, and this is in financial year 2025. Of course, US still remains our largest trading partner, but this deal could change a lot of that. And let's not forget there's a catch. Indian exports to Europe face an average tariff of about 3.8%. This doesn't sound high when you look at what Trump is charging us, but until you look at the sectors that employ millions of Indians, and that's in textiles and clothing, duties can be still around a high 10%. And this hurts Indian exporters when they have to compete with other major textile exporters like Vietnam and Bangladesh to the EU. Now, if you take a look at other labor-heavy segments like leather, footwear, and auto parts, tariffs run anything between 6 to 20% again seen very, very high when you look at competitors. Now, for Europe, the story is the reverse. They look upon India as a $4.2 trillion economy with 1.4 billion people as consumers. India is seen as one of the fastest growing big markets in the world, but it's also highly protected, and that's what the EU was complaining all the time. They claim that they face a weighted average tariff of about 9.3% on its exports to India or into India, and certain categories are especially steep. For instance, auto and auto parts are at around 35.5%. That's what India charges as tariffs to the EU. Plastics around 10.4%, and chemicals and pharmaceuticals, all big exports, around 9.9%. So European firms have argued that these barriers raise the entry costs and keep India's market artificially expensive. So these are the broad brushstrokes of the deal, the EU-India free trade agreement. And as you can see, there were plenty of contentious issues to be sorted out, and that's why it took more than 3 years. So to drill down the specifics and what all this means, I'm delighted to welcome Ajay Srivastava, founder of the respected Global Trade Research Initiative and a former negotiator for the Indian government. So Ajay, welcome to Nothing But the Truth.
Thanks, Raj.
Now let's begin. In your opinion, what does this FTA with Europe, with the EU, change for an average Indian in 2026? Is it jobs, prices, or both? What is it that you think really is the big deal about it?
So for 2026, it will bring a good news only, but the FTA will take at least a year to be implemented. So it will not be implemented before 2027 because EU has 27 member states and they all go to their parliament for getting approvals on the legal documents. It takes more than a year. So it may be implemented somewhere in 2027. And once it's implemented, it will be a great deal for both the sides. For Indian sides, as you rightly said, EU is a $20 trillion market. Rich consumers, 450 million rich consumers are there. And the best thing is that why we call it mother of all deals is we are negotiating with EU, but it's a customs union. So we get access to all the 27 partner countries with one FTA. So 27 rich European countries with one FTA. That's the beauty of it. We save a lot of time by negotiating with a customs union here, and they are already rich. They have high GDP. We have already established trade with them. More than 6,000 European firms are already in India, and I think the beginning is great.
Now, if you take a look at how big this gain is going to be, for instance, if by removing EU duties of around 6 to 20% on items like garments and footwear, how much will this boost trade towards Europe? I'm just giving some examples, but I'm sure there are plenty more. How does this change in terms of jobs, in terms of what we exports as well towards them?
So for labor-intensive goods, tariffs are very high in Europe. Their average tariffs are around 3%, 3.4%. But tariffs on labor-intensive goods, especially textiles and garments or leather or shoes, are high. They range from 8% to more than 20%. So what was happening is that we were competing with countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh for the EU market. And Bangladesh was getting zero tariff access in the EU market because of the GSP scheme for least developed countries. Vietnam already has an FTA with EU, so they were also getting zero tariff access. So our labor-intensive goods were beaten purely on tariff margins. That tariff will be equalized, it will be zero for India, and it will give immediate push to our labor-intensive goods. Only thing, a caveat is there, it's a rich consumer market. So only high-end goods, people who are exporting from India, high-end goods, they will see substantial jump in their exports. People who are exporting low end, they may not find much change in the EU market.
Now let's get into some of the contentious issues that were negotiated. For instance, the EU wanted access to Indian agriculture and dairy farm markets. Now both of these are reportedly excluded from the FTA. Does that protect our farmers, or does Europe get to leverage through other chapters later? Is it a lock deal where we are keeping agriculture and dairy products out, or there is a graded sort of approach towards it?
So, Raj, we have to see the papers to know what part of agriculture has been excluded. My sense is that processed food, processed agriculture food may have been allowed. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing it. So, core agriculture like grains, they are excluded from both the sides, and rightly so, because these are not a trade subject for us. More than 700 million people, they depend on farming in India. It's a livelihood issue. They are not very productive in India. And on the other hand, the EU farmers are highly subsidized, highly mechanized, and because of subsidy, they can dump their products in, say, one cycle and may not dump in another cycle. That will create havoc. It has created already havocs in African market, Tanzania and Nigeria. Many markets has created. We didn't want to that to happen. That's why we are opposing that with US also, US negotiations also, in EU also. And I think EU understood India's predicament, and they both the sides together they agreed, okay, let's not open the markets for each other.
Fine. And now let's take a look at other problem areas that need to be ironed out or have been ironed out. The import of cars, for instance, from Europe. India's import duties on fully built vehicles is around 100 to 125%. European car makers wanted that slashed to 10 to 20%. Now, if that happens, luxury cars could become significantly cheaper in India. But does it also trigger fears in India about local manufacturing and employment? There is also a domino effect. If you give Europe deep concessions, you may have to offer similar terms to Japan and South Korea, which could weaken incentives for what we call the Make in India manufacturing. So what kind of compromise do you think this FTA has reached on this issue?
So auto industry contributes to 1/3 of India's manufacturing GDP. It's big. And the auto industry has been created based on tariff protection, high tariffs, as you rightly said, 100%, 125%. And we have not offered any concessions to, say, Japan and Korea. The moment we open the doors for EU or any other country, we'll be receiving requests from those countries to allow them also. Once we allow everyone who would love to manufacture in India, very few people, it will be only traded. And we have an example in Australia. In 80s, they were having 10 automobile companies making cars for Australia. And the tariff protection was 45%. Then Australia, under some understanding, they started cutting those tariffs. They bought them to 5% next 10 years. Everybody shut shop, disappeared. Now Australia, every single car on Australian road is imported car. We don't want that to happen. So I think in EU deal, government realizes this predicament, and they will be allowing tariff reductions not to zero, but from say 100% to 40%. Below that, we may allow certain number of cars at the lower tariff, but not infinite number of cars. So for automobile, government knows the sensitivity, and so since EU wants access, some access will be allowed, but in a very calibrated way.
Now let's take the other big issue, which is wine and whiskey. Imported wines to India face a 150% tariff today. Europe wants that cut to 10 to 20%. Should India cut this tariff, and what's the economic logic? What's the political risk?
So much of noise is there always on wines. But look at the import data. We import just $8 million worth of wine from Europe, and whiskeys, all kind of whiskeys, scotch and everything, less than $90 million. Wine is only $8 million, less than $8 million. So our current tariffs are 150%. And we have devised a way to offer tariff cuts in our FTAs. And we have perfected that, started that with Australia, then UAE, and then EFTA also. What we do is that we say, if the price, your wine is expensive, then we offer you more tariff cuts because it will not be competing with the local wines.
Right.
And if your wine is cheap, say less than $5 a bottle, a 750 ml bottle, 650 ml bottle, then we allow you to cut tariffs at over a longer period, and we don't allow you to cut deeper cuts. So I think with EU, a lot of pressure is there on India, but India will be sticking to what it has offered to other tariff partners, other FTA partners.
Okay, so that is a graded kind of approach that we have for wine and whiskey.
Yes.
Let's take the bigger battle that India faces with the US, which is just not tariffs, with the EU, sorry. The EU has, what we call non-tariff barriers that can blunt the gains from any FTA. Now, for Indian exporters, there's a dense maze of testing, certification, regulatory approvals, and food and agriculture exports, for instance, face what is called SPS, or sanitary and phytosanitary rules. Even familiar products like basmati, spice, tea, marine exports can face rejections or heightened inspections due to changes in residue limits or antibiotic sampling. And of course, we know Indian chemical manufacturers face compliance regimes like REACH, which stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. So how can India get around these barriers?
Only talk. We have to talk, and there is not enough time in the FTA negotiation process to resolve these issues. Both the sides have to set up a mechanism, a committee to look into issues, and India can list its top 50 products and ask EU to resolve the issues on a predefined time frame. For example, I take the example of, say, rice. So rice we export everywhere. We're the largest exporter. And how much pesticide should be there in the trace amount so there is a scientific basis. Suppose US says it's 50 milligram per kg of rice is okay. It should not exceed that. But EU will be saying 5. I cannot even measure 5. They cannot also measure. They don't. So they become unreasonable. And we say it's non-tariff barrier because you simply don't want to allow import. The reason you are giving is this. This reason is frivolous. So we want to discuss all such reasons where we want to tell them these are unscientific. Nobody else is following that. You are the only one. So please reform your processes. This happens with rice, honey, and fish, as rightly said. Chemical they have reached. If I want to export my medical devices, the registration charge per device is 1 lakh euros. It's very high. So they make it very high by charging high fees or by unreasonable standards they set. These needs to be discussed. These cannot be resolved in an FTA, but these have to be taken separately under a precise time frame.
And that's a very important thing because we could then get lower tariffs, but then have these non-tariff barriers really block our exports. That's a very good point you made. Let's take another look at another big battle that India has to wage with EU, and this is called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. For products like steel and aluminium, for instance, CBAM acts like a new border charge, and this is all linked to carbon emissions. It's a complex subject, but essentially it talks about climate change, the impact of it, and the carbon emissions that is there, and then Europe then puts barriers based on that in terms of what kind of emission levels that are agreeable to it. So India's argument is straightforward. If Europe removes tariffs with one hand but imposes a climate-linked charge with it, the FTA then becomes structurally imbalanced. So the question is, if tariffs go to zero but CBAM adds a new border charge for steel, aluminium and other products, doesn't it cancel the benefits, and how have we sorted this out?
So EU has given certain carve-outs to US. Enough details are not available, but it is reported that in their deal with the US, they have given many carve-outs. So we say that carve-out should be extended to India also because you extended to another trading partner. And our fear is today it's steel and aluminium. But EU has said that they will be covering all industrial products, everything in the next 6-7 years under CBAM. So by the time the agreement starts getting implemented, we may have 50 more products. Today we are talking about steel, aluminum, but 50 more products. Ultimately, next 6-7 years, all products. So it's a serious issue. And what will happen is, as you rightly said, that their products will keep on coming at zero tariffs in India. Our products will not. They'll be paying CBAM charges. So will not gain. So non-tariff barriers plus CBAM, there's 2-3 more problems. I mean, unless these are resolved, it will not be a free flow of goods.
Okay, I mean, that's something we need to keep look out at the fine print of it, CBAMs, these non-trade barriers, whether we're able to get them to ease on that, and therefore we benefit as well. So that is something we'll have to watch out once it is signed. Finally, let's look at services, which is India's real strength. This, I'm told, is another cliff edge kind of negotiation that has been going on. India wants easier movement for skilled professionals, short-term visas, and totalization agreements. Now, this is to avoid double social security payments. India also wants mutual recognition of qualifications, and most crucially, India wants recognition as a data-secure country under what is called the Europe's GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation. This is to reduce friction for cross-border IT and digital services. Now, on its part, apparently Europe wants India to move closer to GDPR style rules, and also wants access to India's banking, legal, and financial services spaces. So what are the three must-haves if you look at it, and what is realistically, let's say politically, what is realistic in Europe for us to get past on this particular part of the services agreement that is there?
So, Europe is an important market for services. Second biggest market after the US for IT services. And IT services, most of the services are delivered remotely across the internet, across the borders, without any physical presence. So what EU is saying is that anyone who wants to provide remote services from India, they should open an office in EU. That defeats the definition of remote services. Second, the people who are doing this job, their wages should be above a minimum threshold. That will again make it difficult. And second, third thing is, as you rightly said, we are requesting that for us to do cross-border supplies properly, we need to be given data secure status like they have given to Japan or South Korea. But as you mentioned, that they are saying India should first follow their GDPR. We are saying we have DPDP, so that is close to GDPR. So these things are being negotiated. We don't know what has been the verdict, what has been the settlement finally. We'll come to know on 27th on these things. Another point is that we are also asking for visas for skilled professionals. I don't think we will get much success in that because of anti-immigration sentiments all across the Europe right now. And after we are also talking about totalization agreement, that if people, our professionals who are settled there for a few years, they should not pay social security two times, once in India, another there. So these things are there. Everything is being hotly debated for years, and we'll come to know on 27th what is finally agreed.
So as you say, the fine print is finally on all
Yes.
these critical issues. We have to see what it comes out when the deal is signed, and that is hopefully going to happen on 27th, but could also be delayed depending on if these negotiations are not completed, might take another week, 2 weeks, whatever it is. But there is a impetus to have this deal. And let's look at finally, the final question to you is, will this help India diversify away from the US, which has imposed such high tariffs? Is there a huge political signal, a geopolitical signal being sent to America? Look, we are not dependent on you. We have this whole raft of countries, and now EU signing with us that can overtake you as India's largest trading partner. What is your sense of that?
As you mentioned, government is moving very fast on the FTA front, and they will help in some diversification away from US. But we must understand, US is a big market, like EU is also a big market, and only some part of it can be absorbed by EU. Rest we have to look for other markets also. EU, big economy, they will absorb some, but America, we export so much that I say 10, 15, 20% can be absorbed in EU. Rest we have to think about it, where to export.
Very well put. If EU considers this the mother of all deals, I think signing up with America will be the father of all of them if we can finally do it. And there seems to be some positive indications. That's been there for a while. But let us see. But most importantly, India is out there actively seeking big trade deals, free trade agreements. And that is a big, big change. As you said, this is the 9th deal that is there, and that makes our options even better. Ajay Srivastav, thank you so much for your incisive insights in helping us understand this very complex India-Europe free trade agreement that could prove to be a big game changer in the months ahead or the years ahead. Thank you very much, Ajay.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with me in this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.